All right, so on the back of the seven ministers giving an update and answering questions on the action to achieve long-term energy supply, we're then having a conversation on that, and let's get some analysis. Then we then bring in and are joined via Zoom by energy expert Ted Blom. Mr. Blom, thanks very much for giving us your time here on SABC News. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much.
First, let's start by getting your comments, really, in terms of the ministers that have been put together for this, what's being called Energy Crisis Committee, the 7 ministers, Godongwana, Gungubele, Godan, Mantashe, Patel, Cele, Creasy. Is this the way to deal with the issue or the crisis? Is this the best way to start? I mean, we've always been saying, where do we start?
Well, I mean, I've heard part of the feedback from the 7 wise people. And after 7 days, because it's about a week since Mr. Ramaphosa announced the crisis committee, the fact of the matter is they seem to be moving far too slowly and far too lightly to address a crisis. If this is a crisis, I would expect measures in the form of 3 or 4 steps. You know, an emergency situation to solve by the end of September, to stop the load shedding, for instance, as a target. And then thereafter, some of the nice things that they're talking about of bringing in more households. I see some Eskom's been given to November to determine feed-in tariffs. I mean, all the while, South Africa is burning. You know, people are losing jobs. Businesses are closing left, right, and center. So I'm afraid the president said he's going to relieve the red tape. But I've been involved in some intergovernmental discussions, and I mean, some of them take a year to just pass a resolution. Yeah. You know, and I can't see the 7 wise people forming a expeditious, effective task force to sort out this crisis, even any time before the end of the year. In fact, at this rate that we're moving on, I'd be surprised if we even stop the load shedding within 2 years.
I suppose in their defense, you know, and this is something that was raised, was the fact that they're saying that, you know, changes need to be made, as you rightly point out, to rules and regulations of procuring power. I mean, obviously, you're not on the government side, but from where you are, how can that indeed be fast-tracked when we're talking about those, you know, entrenched regulations? And I suppose legally, it's difficult to kind of move as quickly as you and I would desire.
No, I hear your comment, but I strongly disagree. I mean, if the president announced that this energy thing was a crisis and announced the state of emergency on energy, then like he quickly did with the COVID example, then a whole lot of levers open up to the government. Beirut, when they had that massive fertilizer explosion in the harbor next to their power station, they restored power within 7 days. I know of emergency suppliers who can supply from week 3, 1 gigawatt a week of additional emergency power. And they're happy to do that for a period of up to 2 to 3 years, maybe a bit longer, depending on the needs of the situation. That's emergency type of action that you take, or crisis committee action that you take, is to stop the bleeding as soon as possible. Put a tourniquet around or do something, get the patient into ICU. But yeah, the patient isn't even near the ICU. We are talking about talks and plans about future actions and so on. Really, when Mr. Mbeki, I don't want to compare political leaders, but when Mr. Mbeki was faced with a similar crisis during his first term, I mean, he appointed presidential project teams, and those project teams were staffed by professionals. I was happy to be a member of one of those, and we delivered a record number of projects within a record amount of time and under very tight budget conditions. That is crisis committee action force type of stuff. Having TV shows after a week to give feedback which is minimal, I'm afraid doesn't cut the mustard.
All right, let's forget then about the regulations for a second. Let's pretend we're not worried about the rules and regulations when changes have to be made. Let's bring in another issue then, and this was actually quite an important issue that was raised by one of the reporters. I heard a question there about environmental sensitivity, and you know, as we're saying that the urgency is to reduce the severity and frequency of load shedding, the plan should then also bear in mind things like environmental sensitivity. And, we need to also be careful about, flouting environmental issues at the expense of addressing load shedding. Is that important to you? Is that something that should indeed, well, from my side of view, my point of view, should indeed be an important factor? But to you, is that an important factor, worrying about, environmental issues?
Look, nobody enjoys inhaling filthy air, and I certainly wouldn't want that to be my legacy to my offspring. So, but the fact of the matter is, we've lost more than 3 million jobs through this pussyfooting by Eskom over the last 14 years, when they knew this was going to happen. They were very aware that this was going to happen, and they did nothing. So the fact of the matter is, if we've got to offset the cost of lives, of livelihoods, of children, the next generation having the opportunity of going to school or not going to school, then I suspect that in my dictionary, I would put environmental issues a little bit aside. Not to say that you can go like the Wild West about this matter, but the fact of the matter is that we are facing a crisis, a massive crisis, which is bleeding into our economy, is bleeding into our people's lives. And I really would have thought that we would have applied ICU type of measures to stop the bleeding and then worry about the niceties. I'm not saying that this must last forever. Just stop the bleeding and stop it as soon as possible. Thereafter, we can return to normal. But this whole program smacks to me as business as usual, because I've heard all of these efforts mentioned before via either the president or the Eskom board or the Eskom management team. So there's very little new stuff here, and certainly none of it smacks to me of being of critical type of actions that I would have expected us to take, given the disastrous situation that we are facing.
All right, thanks very much. Giving us your time there, Ted Blom, energy expert, speaking to us on the back of the 7 ministers meeting, the Energy Crisis Committee, who gave us an update on how they plan to achieve long-term energy supply a short while ago.